this is Shar Nicole with the GreatHER Purpose Podcast, and I have my lovely co-host, Dr. Leah McMillan of EnSpire Counseling. And today we are recognizing, we're still in the month of April, so we are recognizing sexual assault. And our title for today's episode is Addressing Sexual Assault in Our Communities. Before we begin, I know that we've talked about different topics before, but do you think there's a stigma about discussing sexual assault in our communities? Would you say that there's a stigma about it?
Absolutely. I think that it makes people feel uncomfortable. I think that sometimes they don't want to use the terminology. I think that sometimes, honestly, it hits close to home because of the numbers, because of the individuals that we know that have been either harassed, assaulted, raped. And so I think it makes people feel uncomfortable. But it's those uncomfortable topics like this one that we've got to address if we are going to end sexual violence.
What are some things that we can be on the lookout for when it comes to as far as survivors or victims of sexual assault?
So we just need to be aware of, or we need to be aware of our surroundings. We need to be cautious when we go out. When I teach students at the university, I talk a lot about using the buddy system. The buddy system worked at age 2. It works at 92. Go with a friend. Make sure that someone knows where you are. Don't accept a drink from a stranger or even from someone that you know, unless you absolutely watch the drink being poured. Meet someone that you don't really know. Maybe you've never met them. Maybe it's your first date, or maybe you really don't know them all that well. Meet them in a public place. There's a lot of safety factors that come up. Don't announce on social media that you're going on vacation for a week and your home is empty, or you're going by yourself to this conference. Sometimes sharing too much can be unsafe. But saying all of that, at the end of the day, it's never a victim's fault. It doesn't matter where she goes or who she goes with or what she wears. The fact of the matter is, our bodies are the one thing that we should be able to control, that we should be able to protect, that we should be able to keep safe. No one should ever abuse or hurt our bodies, period. So I say all the safety warnings to say, yes, we need to be aware. We need to educate ourselves. We need to create prevention. We need to bring awareness. We need to decrease the stigma. But we also need to recognize that victims are never to blame for what has happened to them. The blame is solely on the perpetrator. And sexual assault is about power and control. It's not about the act of sex. It's not the act of attraction. It is solely about power and control.
I wanted to bring up a valid point because I went to the Essence Festival years ago, and some of my friends were laughing at me because I wouldn't go anywhere by myself. And it was like, well, Shar, you act like a big baby. And I'm like, I'm old school. And I remember my mother used to tell me, she was like, when I went to college, she was like, don't drink anyone else's drink. Don't pick up a drink. Don't go anywhere unfamiliar by yourself, even familiar places. So not to say that it's our fault if something happens to us, but just to be more mindful, like you said, of our surroundings and where we're around. But with that being said, do you find in your field of work that a lot of times these are people that the victims know personally in some type of way?
Absolutely. So in our previous podcast, we talked about child abuse, which of course child sexual abuse is a part of child abuse. So we know that 90% of child sexual victims knew their perpetrators. We also know when it comes to sexual assault with adults, teenagers, young adults and adults, victims of sexual assault, that 80% of those victims knew their perpetrators. Now, that could have been just an acquaintance. It could have been your lab partner in your class, or it could be your best friend. It could be your coach. It could be that mentor that was your trusted adult. So in these cases, the majority of these cases had some form of relationship or recognized their perpetrator. So it's not, yes, do we have cases that involve stranger rape and sexual assault and kidnapping? Absolutely. But the majority of cases, victims knew their perpetrators. Every 73 seconds, less than a minute, Shara, in this country, someone is sexually assaulted. And every 9 minutes, that victim is a child.
Well, let me ask you this, because that's devastating. You know, that number I've heard before, but it still is devastating to hear that data. Do you find that a lot of the people that are doing this to children, victimizing children, maybe they've been through it themselves, or is that something that's just kind of a myth? Do we know why people are doing this type of thing? And I'm not well, that's a different subject, but like for instance, I used to be very enthralled with crime stories, like with Ted Bundy and Gacy. I don't know why, but I went through this space. I used to always try to figure out what would cause a person to do that to someone. So do you find it a trend with a lot of times the perpetrator being a victim themselves, or maybe it's a list of other things going on? What would you say is probably the commonality with the people that are perpetrating this onto other people? Because it's not always women either. And I think that's another myth that people, and we can talk about that too, but that's something I'm starting to see a lot of men come out and say that they've been sexually assaulted and raped, and people laugh at them or just put them down. And I'm like, no, that can actually really happen. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to ask you two questions at once, but because I just think it's so interesting how we view the standard as far as if you're a woman and you're sexually assaulted, it's one thing, but if you're a man, then it's like people find it almost impossible that could happen. So my first part of my question really is, do you see a trend with perpetrators being victims themselves when they assault other people? And the second part of that is, well, we'll get back to the second part, but.
Well, so to tie in to what you were saying, 1 in 4 girls will experience some form of sexual violence, sexual abuse in their lifetime. 1 in 13 boys will. We've got to just stop saying that females and females only are victims. Males can be victims too. Now, statistic-wise, we do know that there are more females that are victims, which is why we use that pronoun. But we have got to start recognizing that males are victims too. Females can be victimized by males and females. Males can be victimized by males and females as well. So to go back to, why do people abuse? Why do they assault? Why do they rape? I think it's a multi-factor answer. I do think, and we do know, there's a significant portion of perpetrators who re-victimized based on being victimized. So we do know that cycle of abuse continues. We know that victims of abuse and domestic violence are higher at risk for continuing that cycle of abuse, continuing to be victims, just like we also know that child victims, especially boys that are exposed to trauma, exposed to family violence, that are victims themselves, continue the cycle as perpetrators. So if we want to end family violence and sexual assault and rape, we start with ending child abuse. But I'm not going to say that every perpetrator out there was a victim, by no means, because again, it goes back, especially with sexual assault, rape, sex trafficking, it goes back to power and control. They want power. They want control. They feel like they can objectify their victim, that their victim does not have a voice.
So with that being said, I guess my next question, and like I said, I'm intrigued by it because I see it so much lately when we see celebrities that are just now being convicted of things from when they're younger days of sexual assault, rape, things of that nature. And human trafficking is a growing focus area I've noticed with a lot of across the board with a lot of organizations and communities. But when it comes to sexual assault and rape and things of that nature, one thing that our society, and I've heard this recently, and that's why I'm bringing it up. I've heard some guys talking, and they were kind of bragging on the fact that they taught a 14-year-old pretty much to have sex at his age, and it was it was glorified for some reason. And when I look at other men that have experienced that type of position that they've been in, a lot of times they would say that they were not necessarily ready for that, or it caused a domino effect with how they view women or themselves, or even same sex situations. So why do you think not we glorify it, but why do you think that is? Because when I was listening to the statistics, what I thought of is that even though the number 1 in 13, I'm thinking there has to be a lot of more young men or boys that are not even speaking up about it because of that perception that if you're a guy, that can't happen to you, but it really can. And
Absolutely.
we teach girls to, stay pure, or, not to be out there, but then we're glorifying boys to do it as a way of being a man or part of their manhood. And that's not really a healthy way to introduce someone to anything of that nature. So I guess what I really want to ask is, what can we do to support victims and survivors of rape? And like I said, it's male and female, and we see a lot more now of males speaking out about it. But what can we do to support that and to really end that stigma? Because if you don't want to have sex, and if you are being forced to do something, male or female, that's not right. It's not right. It's not something that should be glorified or okay. And I just feel like a lot of times what I've seen in the media a lot lately, the last couple of years, is, oh, well, that happened 20 years ago. Why is that a big deal? But it carries on with those people that have endured that experience to no fault of their own. So what can we do to support survivors and victims of sexual assault and rape, whether they're male or female?
Well, just what we're doing, we've got to talk about this. We have sexualized this generation.
Yes.
Society is all about, what does your image look like? What does your body look like? We are open and want to show everything. And in doing that, individuals that are not ready to be sexualized feel like they're coerced, feel like there's something wrong with them if they're not to that age. The fact of the matter is, a 14-year-old, male or female, should not be having sex. They cognitively cannot make that healthy decision. So we have to stop sexualizing everything, and we got to start teaching healthy relationships. Healthy relationships within ourselves first, because we got to love ourselves. We got to respect our own bodies before we can ask somebody else to. And then we've got to also teach that it's okay to say, no, I don't want to wear this or look this way or do these things. It's okay if I want to wait before I am intimate, that I want to make sure that I am ready for this. And we have to teach both men and women, boys and girls, you ask before you do anything. You ask before you hold hands. You ask before you kiss your date good night at the door. You ask before you give them a hug. You ask before you touch them in any type of intimate way. We ask permission for someone to come into our safe bubble. And we've got to teach kids and teenagers and young adults adults in general, that they have a right to ask, request, expect that. If someone does not respect your body, your decisions, what you are saying, yes, I'm okay with this. No, I'm not okay with this. Yes, I'm okay going here. No, I'm not okay going there. Yes, I'm okay drinking this. No, I'm not okay drinking this. Whatever the situation is, if they don't respect you, that's not a healthy relationship. And you distance yourself or you sever those relationships. But we've got to teach people to use their voice, to love themselves, respect themselves. And if something happens, listen to them without shaming, without saying, well, what if you did this? Or should you have done that? Or maybe you shouldn't have wore that mini skirt. Hey, she has some rocking legs. Let her wear that mini skirt. That doesn't mean that anyone deserves to touch her in an inappropriate way.
Not open invitation.
It's not an open invitation. Absolutely. You asked for permission. There's no excuse whatsoever. And teaching that and having these conversations and listening and recognizing that, you know what, somebody may not have disclosed for 20 years. They could have been holding on to this trauma, but the trauma is still valid. They are disclosing now. They are processing now. Let's meet that victim where they're at to help them to become a survivor and a thriver.
And I really like that point you made, because I've noticed a lot too, especially in the media, where a victim comes out and for whatever reason, we make it the victim's fault that something happened to them, especially if it's like a well-known celebrity or someone that's very popular. Oh, well, they asked for it or they wanted it and they knew what they were getting into. That's not necessarily the case. Like, I remember years ago, a celebrity, and I won't say his name, was accused of raping someone. And I remember a friend of mine was like, well, that's so-and-so, he's famous. She knew what she was doing when she went to his room. And I was like, well, just because she went to the room, I could see how that looked. But that doesn't mean that she wanted that. That doesn't mean that she was, and maybe she did, and then she changed her mind. And that's another thing too, that it's okay to say no, it's okay to change your mind. That does not give you an open invitation to take from someone that safe space or that comfort. And so I find it very interesting, especially when I see in the media when a victim, because it takes a lot of guts to come out and say that someone has raped you. It takes a lot of courage to do that. And it just seems like, and I understand why a lot of victims do not want to come out, because it's just like, well, what did you do to provoke it? It's never, how can I help you? Are you okay? What can I do to support you? It's always, well, you've had to ask, because I hear that a lot, even like with common people, when someone says they were raped or molested or whatever the case may be, people treat them as if they did something to ask for it. And that's never really made sense to me. I'm just like, if someone forces themselves or on you, how is that your fault?
Absolutely. No means no. And if you can't give consent, it's automatically no consent. Mm-hmm. So I'm just gonna be real. You know, I'm real when it comes to this because, you know, this is my passion area. I've done it for 18 years. That's how I started in the field. I worked these calls. I answered these calls for 13 years. What I tell young people, adults, teenagers, I don't care if she is dancing naked on a bar. The fact of the matter is, when she said no, it meant no. If she gave you permission to hold her hand, you had permission. If she gave you permission to give her a hug, you had permission. But the moment she said no, or the moment he could not give consent, I don't care if it's male or female, that's when you stop. That's when you take them home and you make sure they're safe and we don't abuse. That's when you call a cab. That's when you call their best friend. That's when you protect them. You don't assault them.
One thing, and I'm probably showing my age saying this, but one thing my mom used to always tell me and my sisters was, no matter how old you are, someone should always know where you're at. Because if something happens to you, and I didn't understand it as a teenager, but now I totally get it now. because just because you're an adult does not mean something can't happen to you.
That's right.
And I even have to be more cognizant sometimes because I'm alone a lot, and I'm like, okay, I gotta watch my surroundings. I check my back, like I check everything. And my son is always like, Mom, like, are you a little paranoid? I'm like, no, I just have to, for peace of mind, I have to know my surroundings. Being a single female, like I have to know that. But the thing about it is that we have to be open to those types of discussions and being okay letting somebody know, check someone in. If I don't come home by this time, something's wrong. Or even my friends, like I can go to a friend's house right now and I can be there for an hour or two. And they're like, Charlotte, let me know when you get home. And I think sometimes people take that for granted, but there's a valid reason why someone should always know where you're going, when you're coming back, not to keep tabs on you, but just to make sure that accountability of making sure you're safe and that you're okay. And I think even for myself, I've taken advantage of that in the past, but now I get it. Like someone should know where I'm at. Someone should know if I made it home safely, because if something happens to me and no one knows where I was going, where I was supposed to be, then that's a whole list of someone could have kidnapped me, whatever the case may be. And I think we have to be okay with being accountable for each other and checking in just to protect and look out for one another. Because, with this stuff that I see on the news and all over social media, it can be a lot. And a lot of times people are like, well, I thought she was going this place, or I thought he was supposed to go here, and no one knows where that person is or where they ended up because no one was able to check in. So I think we also have to be able to be open to check in with people that care about us, let them know, look, if I don't call you by this time, call me or come by the house or make sure I'm there.
Absolutely.
And I'm a little old school with that because, like I said, some of my younger friends are just like, but I'm like, it's a reason. I mean, it's really for your own good to protect you and to look out for you. So I think that's something that we have to kind of keep in mind as well. What resources do we have here locally for people that have been victimized by sexual assault or rape or anything of that nature?
So the number one resource we have is the Haven Rape Crisis Center that is available 24/7. We also, of course, for victims under the age of 18, the Child Advocacy Center. If you have been assaulted or think you may have been assaulted, even if you're not sure you were victimized, but maybe you were slipped a date rape drug, you can always go to the local hospital, go to the local emergency room. You can talk to your general practitioner, your OBGYN, or you can call your local counseling center. You can call EnSpire Counseling and Wellness. I am part of the local START protocol. I will get you to the right individual. We have a team, we have a protocol in place in our community where the collaborating partners come together to help victims, survivors, and their families. With what you said before, I want to bring up this point to add on to your point. It is very hard for victims of sexual assault to come forward. Again, our bodies are the one thing we should be able to control. We lose that control. I will never forget years ago, I had a commander at a local police department that I worked with that said, in his opinion, rape was worse than homicide. Because in homicide, those victims are no longer suffering. But rape victims and sexual assault victims live the rest of their life knowing what they went through. Now, I have met the strongest survivors, the most courageous, the most resilient. So we don't have to allow that crime to define us, but it affects us. And we've got to talk about that impact. We've got to validate trauma and stop minimizing trauma. So we have resources locally. The Haven Child Advocacy Center, you call EnSpire, you go to your local hospital. Only 10 to 20% of sexual assaults are reported. That means 80 to 90% are not. The myth out there that victims make false reports, only 1 to 2% of cases are false reports. We got to stop that myth.
Right.
Because it hurts all the victims that are brave enough to come forward. We got to believe, we got to listen, we got to support, we got to love, we got to encourage. We've also got to prevent. We've got to create awareness. We've got to talk to our children from early on, 2, 3, 4 years old, what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. That's how we end sexual violence. That's how we end sex trafficking. That's how we end child abuse. Unfortunately, all 3 of those are interlinked.
Yeah. And, it's so interesting because I hear people all the time talk about that can't happen here. That's not happening here. And I'm like, it happens more than you think it does. During my time on the board for the Haven, I was even surprised at the number of human trafficking victims and, just victims in general in the community or around the community. I'm just like, I don't think people realize how serious this problem is. And it's, it's not what you think. Sexual violence is not a poster for every victim. There's different types of victims, rich, poor, in between, Black, white, purple, young, old. I mean, it's very diverse. And I think sometimes people think, oh, well, it's in this community, it can never happen. That's not true. It can happen in any community. It happens in some of the best communities. Just from my time on the board, I'm just like, I was so naive to that because in my mind, I'm thinking, well, it might happen in, the lower income, and I mean, that was very naive on my end. But what I think people also need to understand is that you have to be open to know that it's a diverse situation. It doesn't matter how much money you make. It doesn't matter your level of education. There are sexual assault victims of all walks of life, of all ages.
Absolutely. Sexual violence does not discriminate. You're
right.
Absolutely right. It is not about socioeconomic status. It is not about gender. It's not about sexual orientation. It's not about religious values and beliefs. It is across the board. Sexual violence can happen to anyone at any time.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, thank you so much, Dr. McMillan. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, just listen. Just open up your heart, open up your mind, just support and encourage. It may make you feel uncomfortable, but that's where we grow, is in those uncomfortable moments. And I can tell you that when you're able to look a victim in the eye and say, I hear you, I'm here for you, I support you, that victim will never forget that. So thank you so much for having me and for being willing to talk about these difficult topics. I know it's not about rainbows and butterflies, but the fact of the matter is we've got to talk about these topics. We've got to end sexual violence in our country. We have got to teach individuals to love themselves, to respect themselves, to validate who they are and who they want to be.
Definitely. And one thing about this platform is that the purpose is to definitely talk about those difficult topics because just to be transparent, I am also a survivor of child abuse, sexual abuse as a child. And that took me years to say publicly without crying. And the thing that I learned is that you have to find your purpose through every situation. And I want people to understand that when you go through something, any type of abuse, mental, emotional, physical, sexual, whatever, because I'm very open about it now, but not so. This is the first time I probably said it on the show. But what I've learned, because people say, well, how do you overcome it? It's not about really overcoming. It's just you don't let it define you. And you can still be that person that you're ordained or created to be, despite what has happened to you. And so this platform is not only to focus on the positive, but to talk about those hard things and how did people overcome. And one thing I want victims or survivors, I don't like to say victims, survivors to understand is that no matter what you've been through, you can overcome it and you can still fulfill your purpose. And your story and your walk of life can inspire and support someone else's journey that may not be as comfortable talking about it. Like I said, I've had people on the show before who have talked about it openly, and I've never said a word about it. But I think what people need to understand is that no matter what you look like, how smart you are, no matter what, you can overcome it. And it does not have to define you. And that's really what this platform was built on, is not allowing life to define purpose. So I just appreciate
it's empowering yourself. And
right.
Look, you are an incredible survivor. You're thriving. And you have created an amazing platform to help so many people out there. That's how we regain that power that perpetrator tried to take away from us, is when we empower ourselves, when we say, no, I'm not going to allow that to define me. Yes, that's part of what I have gone through. It's part of who I am. It's part of what I grew through, but it doesn't define me.
Oh, I'm a testimony of that. But thank you again, Leah. I really enjoyed these conversations with you, and I'm looking forward to more things to come. I know we have some things coming up soon. But just thank you for your transparency and your passion, because we really need that here in this community. And I know some of your clients who are just crazy about you. So just thank you for sharing this platform with me as well, and sharing your knowledge and expertise, because it makes a difference. And I just appreciate you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sharon. Thank you for being open.
Yes,
Have a
ma'am.
good night.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.